Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. On today's episode, I will be targeting trout from the banks of beautiful Lake Camanche. I hope you guys all had a great Thanksgiving, and on today's episode, without much further ado, let's get going on today's episode. I was having some camera issues with the GoPro at the beginning of the day, so with the secondary camera, I did manage to catch this first bite that I had on the right hand rod. I had both rods out with power bait, and while trying to adjust the GoPro camera, I ended up getting a bite on the right hand rod. Somehow though, the secondary camera was knocked over when these folks decided that they wanted to come down and swim with their dogs next to the one and only angler on this side of the lake. I did, however, end up landing this trout, and it was a very nice Lake Camanche trout. After landing that fish, I ended up putting it on the stringer, and I decided to move away from that area. The water was extremely clear and shallow, and knowing that those folks were going to be out here swimming with their pets, I knew right away that those fish will more than likely not feed. After moving away from that first area, I did however notice that there were some trout cruising this rocky outcrops, so I decided to target them with this shallow diving Rapala. I ended up hooking into this very nice trout, but that ended up spooking all the fish in this area. Even though it is late fall and the water is extremely cold, there were still quite a handful of folks out here enjoying the water. I get it, we all pay money to use the reservoir, but somehow what was extremely annoying to me today was I did end up finding some fish at that first spot, and these people decided that they wanted to come down and swim and barbecue next to the one and only angler on that side of the reservoir. It doesn't make any sense, but I decided to move, and ultimately I ended up hooking into these very nice fish for the day. So in a way, it did end up paying off. This was a beautiful holdover rainbow trout. This fish was probably planted during the spring period and managed to survive all the way throughout the entire summer period. I will put him on the stringer because he will cut up really nice and have some very bright orange fillets. After landing that fish with the Rapala, somehow the rest of these shallow cruising fish ended up being extremely spooked. So therefore, I will target them with power bait. All I have is a basic Carolina style rig with a 1/8 ounce egg sinker and a very tiny snell hook. I will just add a very small chunk of dough bait on the hook, and I will give this a very shallow toss. The water in front of me here is extremely shallow and clear, no deeper than probably 7 to 6 feet. This time of year, during the late fall to early winter transition, a lot of these trout can literally be caught within a few feet from the banks. This time of year, as the water cools down, an angler should never dismiss the shallow water. There are a lot of fish, especially in this reservoir, that had not been caught during the spring stocking period, and these fish will now be cruising the bank along with a lot of fish that are freshly planted. The rod ended up getting a very violent bite while I was trying to set up a second power bait rod, and I knew right away that I hooked into a very nice fish. So what exactly do I mean by there are a lot of fish left from last spring? Well, with the Golden Mussel closure, these East Bay managed reservoirs have not allowed any personal watercraft to be out here fishing on the reservoir, or whether it be for water recreational use as well. So with that being said, a lot of fish that were planted this last spring had survived and are now targetable from the bank. There are some boat rental options, but with the way the economy is shaping out, there aren't many people renting boats nowadays, especially with the watercraft available at these kind of reservoirs. The amount of money this reservoir charges to rent a boat just simply isn't worth it in my opinion. However, with the cold weather moving in fast into Northern California, these fish are once again able to be targeted from the bank successfully by anglers whom are willing to look around. Traditionally, this reservoir was probably one of the most popular reservoirs to fish for trout during the fall and spring period, along with the winter period, especially for boaters whom are out here trolling for trout. But with the Golden Mussel closure, this reservoir had seen virtually no fishing pressure. The only exception are the handful of die-hard bank anglers whom are out here bait fishing for these fish. and they can be definitely targeted successfully from the banks for those guys that are willing to look around. This was a gorgeous holdover trout. He had a bit of copepods on him, and as an example, this fish actually took the power bait very lightly. I barely hooked him in the corner of the jaw, and I'll show you guys exactly how this fish ended up taking the power bait. Yes, with this low clear water, these fish can be extremely skittish. I personally believe that as a bank angler, when targeting these fish from the bank, it is best served in the bank angler's interest to remain as quiet as possible to not spook these fish. I'll show them to you guys real quick, and as a testament, this fish had literally regrown all his fins from surviving throughout the entire spring into the summer period. And I will put him on the stringer as well, because I am looking for a 5 fish limit today. As I've mentioned in my past videos, whenever I'm fishing with power bait, I will fish for keeps, because more times than not, whenever targeting fish with power bait, these fish will not survive the release. I ended up noticing that there were quite a handful of fish cruising this very shallow rocky outcrop. However, these fish were super skittish, and I didn't really want to micro jig. Yes, micro jigging is probably one of the most popular techniques at this reservoir. It is not just popular in the small fishing pond available on the south end of the lake, but it is also very popular in the main body of the lake as well. However, I am not a very big fan of micro jigging. I find it to be an extremely slow technique, and if I were to be micro jigging, I might as well just have power bait out in the water, because it is about just the same amount of time waiting for the fish to pick up the bait. Some anglers may disagree and will prefer to micro jig, but in my preference, I much rather just sit there with power bait if I were to be micro jigging. With this second rod, I literally have this power bait placed adjacent to the bank. I know these fish are swimming parallel to the bank, so I want to target these fish in their path of movement. As I've mentioned already, this time of year, an angler should never dismiss the shallow water. There will be fish found in the shallow water, and especially with this reservoir, an angler can literally catch a fish within a few feet from the bank. The rod on the left hand side ended up getting picked up, and I knew right away I caught myself another very nice trout. I know that power bait fishing isn't exactly a very popular way to fish with some anglers, but it is an extremely deadly way to target trout, especially during the late fall into early winter transition period. Whenever I'm out targeting trout at any of these mother lode reservoirs and I'm looking to take a limit of trout home for the grill, I will always bring some power bait with me. Whenever I'm targeting trout from these larger reservoirs from the bank, I will always have some power bait with me. I know it is not a very popular way to fish, but in bodies of water with no special bait regulations, power bait fishing is probably one of the most effective ways for a bank angler to take trout efficiently. As a bank angler, an angler will not have the option of deciding what kind of fish they can target. So if I were to stumble on some very aggressive fish, I can indeed target them with lures, but more times than not, an angler can only target what's in front of them, especially when fishing from the bank. So if faced with some very skittish fish, like what I had today, by far power bait fishing is my go-to. This was a very nice healthy planted rainbow trout. This reservoir had also been getting its fall plant as well, so there are a mix of some very freshly planted fall fish along with a lot of these holdover fish from last spring. The fall fish that were freshly planted into this reservoir will still have their round tail from when they were dumped into the reservoir, but a lot of the holdover fish will most likely have regrown a lot of their fins and will have a bit of copepods on them. I ended up landing this very nice healthy chunky planter rainbow trout, and I'll show him to you guys real quick before putting him on the stringer. This reservoir does get some very healthy planting of rainbow trout, and they'll make really great fillets for the grill. This reservoir also have a small pond that they stock heavily on the south end of the reservoir. It is probably one of the most popular areas for a lot of bank anglers who don't like to target the main body reservoir for trout. While rigging up the rod that just caught the last fish, the rod that was still in the water on the right hand side ended up getting a bite. I will land this last fish and I will call it quits for the day. Ultimately, I did end up catching my 5 fish limit despite that debacle with the first fish I had in the morning and those folks that decided they wanted to fish and swim next to the one and only angler on this entire side of the reservoir. I personally believe that the first area I was at earlier in the day, those fish over there would have fed a lot much better than the fish on this rocky outcropping. Based on my past experiences at this reservoir, what I have found is if I were to see the fish physically, a lot of times the fish that I can spot physically are not often very active feeders. But if I were to find fish that I can't physically see, a lot of those times those fish will feed a lot much more willingly. That first spot I was at in the morning had quite a handful of fish that I wasn't able to see, but I did notice them surfacing a lot much more than this area that I was targeting. However, with those folks coming down to the water's edge and making all that noise, I believe they would have ended up shutting off the bite. As this fish begins to surface near me, I noticed right away that this was a beautiful holdover fish. This fish had grown back all its fins, and judging from all the fins that it had regrown, I guess this fish was probably stocked here last year. This reservoir does produce some very nice rainbow trout for the anglers whom are willing to explore and beat the banks a bit. This fish was beautiful, full fins, and full of colors. I'll show him to you guys real quick, and I'll put him on the stringer and call it quits for the day. Despite catching my limit, I will not be returning to this reservoir until the middle of winter, when the water is too cold for water recreational users to be out on the water. Overall, it was a pretty decent day out here on the beautiful banks of Lake Camanche. I did catch my 5 fish trout limit, and I will take these to the cleaning station. Despite the earlier debacle during the day, I did however end up catching the 5 fish limit by grinding it out with power bait. These are the 5 fish I ended up landing, and these are the very nice orange fillets I ended up getting. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, tight lines y'all.